My son, Leo, slid the papers across my husband's workbench, the same sacred space where Arthur had built his legacy with his bare hands. The pen he offered me was heavy and cold. Power of attorney, the document read in bold letters. It might as well have been my death warrant. I looked at them, my boys. Leo in his $1,000 suit, and Vincent, whose eyes darted around like a cornered animal. They didn't see a mother anymore. They saw an obstacle. The final asset to be liquidated before their digital house of cards came crashing down for good. For a moment, all I could hear was the frantic beat of my own heart. "Sign it, Mom." Leo pushed, his voice tight. "It's over." I took a slow breath, my gaze shifting from their faces to the workshop door behind them. "You're right," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It is over." On that cue, the door swung open. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, followed by a quiet man my sons had never seen before. Leo's face went white. "What is this?" he stammered. I just nodded toward the small black rectangle plugged into the wall outlet. "I believe you'll want to hear last Tuesday's conversation," I said. "The one where you finalized the plan to get rid of me, just like you got rid of your father." Oh. But that explosion, right there in the heart of my husband's workshop, was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. To understand how we reached that breaking point, we need to go back 3 months, to the day I buried my husband and a stranger pressed a note into my hand that changed everything. That note was still folded in my palm, a secret warmth against my cold skin as the last of the mourners filed out of the funeral home. The day I buried Arthur was the quietest day of my life. The world seemed to be holding its breath, and the only sounds I could register were the hollow words of the eulogy and the cloying, sickly sweet smell of too many lilies. It's a smell I'll never be able to stand again. Through the whole service, I watched my sons. Leo, my eldest, the one who was supposed to be the rock, checked his watch, a sleek, offensively expensive thing, twice during the pastor's prayer. Vincent, my youngest, kept subtly angling his phone under the pew, the screen's glow reflecting in his glasses. I knew that glow. It was the frantic up-and-down dance of a cryptocurrency chart. Even in that sacred space, they were somewhere else entirely. They were present in body, but their souls had long since checked out. Back at our house, the one Arthur and I had bought 45 years ago, with a down payment we'd scraped together from 100 side jobs, the quiet was replaced by a low, respectful murmur. Our neighbors, good people from up the street, brought casseroles and condolences. They spoke of Arthur in that kind, hushed way people do, sharing memories of him fixing their lawnmower for free, or offering a piece of his prized tomato harvest over the fence. I saw my daughter-in-law Jasmine accept a hug from Mrs. Gable, and then, when she thought no one was looking, discreetly pull a small bottle of hand sanitizer from her designer purse. My sons moved through the crowd like politicians working a room they couldn't wait to leave. I watched Leo from the kitchen, standing on the back porch, his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't grieving. He was negotiating. His voice was a low, urgent hum, and I could pick out words that felt like sacrilege in my home that day. Unacceptable losses, margin call. We need a capital injection now. A capital injection. Is that what his father had become? Vincent was worse in a way. He sat in Arthur's worn leather armchair, the one with the permanent indent from where my husband sat every evening, and scrolled and scrolled and scrolled. A plate of Costco pinwheel sandwiches, untouched, sat on the end table beside him. A neighbor tried to engage him in a conversation about his father's love for fishing, and Vincent just nodded blankly, his eyes never leaving the screen. He looked up only once, to catch my eye, and offered a weak, pathetic smile that didn't even pretend to be sad. It was the smile of someone asking for a pass, for permission to be absent. I gave him nothing back. I thought of Arthur's hands, broad, calloused, perpetually stained with wood dust and lacquer. They were the hands that had held me during every crisis, built every bookshelf in our home, and coaxed the most beautiful music from pieces of spruce and rosewood in his workshop. His hands created things of lasting, tangible value. My son's hands were smooth and soft, their only calluses from a keyboard or the grip of a Peloton handlebar. Their hands didn't build, they only traded, moving digital nothings around in a virtual world, chasing a phantom of wealth I couldn't begin to understand. Finally, the last neighbor left, offering one final, sincere squeeze of my arm. The silence that descended on the house was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Jasmine started gathering her things with an air of profound relief. That's when Leo walked into the kitchen, a look of grim determination on his face. He still had that plate of pinwheel sandwiches in his hand, a prop to make the ambush feel casual. "Mom, we need to be practical," he began, not even making eye contact. He set the plate down on the granite countertop, the plastic wrap crinkling. "Jasmine and I have been talking, and Vince agrees. We've already had a realtor do a drive-by appraisal on the house in the workshop." I stared at him. The words didn't compute. A drive-by appraisal. My husband had been gone for 72 hours. "We need to move fast to maximize value before the market cools," he continued, his voice gaining a slick, rehearsed confidence. "The workshop property alone is zoned for commercial use. That's the real jackpot. We're talking a significant liquidity event once it's cleared." Cleared? He meant bulldozed. He meant erasing the place where his father had breathed life into wood for 40 years. My hand, which had been resting on the counter, reached for the silver sugar spoon in the bowl next to the coffee maker. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the familiar pattern. Vincent shuffled in behind him, finally detached from his phone. "It's for the best, Mom," he mumbled, looking at his shoes. "Dad wouldn't want you to be burdened with all this stuff." Stuff. Arthur's tools, his designs, his templates, his entire life's work was stuff. I placed the silver spoon down on the counter. The small, sharp clink was the only sound in the room. It was the only protest I had in me at that moment, a tiny note of dissent against their symphony of greed. It was a sound that said, "I am still here. This is still my home. You will not erase him." Leo took my silence as agreement. "Good," he said with a brisk nod. "I'll have the agent draw up the preliminary listing agreement tomorrow. We just need you to be ready to sign." They left a few minutes later, their expensive cars whispering away down the driveway, leaving me alone in the crushing silence of my own home. My gaze drifted to the sturdy oak door at the end of the hallway, the door to the workshop, the door to Arthur's soul. I felt the folded note in my pocket. They planned this. The words were no longer just a paranoid whisper from a stranger. They were a possibility, a horrifying, monstrous possibility that was starting to take root in the wreckage of my heart. That sturdy oak door at the end of the hall felt like a portal to another world, a world that was still mine, still ours. I left the sterile quiet of the kitchen, the ghost of my son's ambition still hanging in the air, and walked toward it. My hand trembled slightly as I turned the old brass key in the lock. The click was loud in the silent house, a sound of permission. Pushing the door open, I was hit with the smell of him. It was the scent of my entire adult life, a rich, clean perfume of cedar and rosewood, the sharp tang of lacquer, and underneath it all the faint, comforting aroma of sawdust and old coffee. This was Arthur's sanctuary. This was home. The workshop was dark, save for a single shaft of moonlight cutting through the high window, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. My eyes adjusted, and the familiar shapes emerged from the shadows like old friends. Guitars, in various states of creation, hung from the walls like sleeping bats. Stacks of raw, beautiful wood were organized with a surgeon's precision blonde maple, deep red mahogany, and a precious, dark-grained set of Brazilian rosewood he'd been saving for 20 years, waiting for the right project. My son saw a commercial lot, a jackpot. I saw a library of sleeping songs. I ran my hand over the top of his workbench. It was a massive slab of maple, 2 inches thick, and its surface was a roadmap of his life. There were nicks from a slipped chisel, rings from 1,000 coffee mugs, and dark stains from glue and lacquer that had soaked deep into the grain. It was worn smooth as river stone in the places where he stood, where his hands had rested and worked for countless hours. This bench was more honest than any bank statement. It told a story of dedication, of frustration, of the slow, patient, glorious act of creation. It was the altar where he practiced his religion. Sitting on his worn wooden stool, the one with a wobbly leg he never got around to fixing, I saw his work shirt hanging on a hook by the door. A simple blue chambray shirt, the cuffs frayed, a fine layer of pale dust settled on the shoulders. Before I could think, I stood up and buried my face in it, inhaling deeply. It was all there. The wood, the coffee, him. A sob, the first real gut-wrenching one of the day, finally broke free from my chest. It was a raw, animal sound of loss in this temple of creation. My eyes fell upon a heavy, leather-bound book on the corner of the bench. His design book. It was his most prized possession, more valuable to him than our house, our car, or any stock we ever owned. I picked it up, the worn leather soft under my fingertips, and opened it to a random page. Inside were his elegant, precise pencil drawings, cross-sections of guitar bodies, intricate rosette patterns for the sound hole, notes on bracing and tonal woods written in his familiar, steady script. Each page was a conversation between his mind and his hands. As I traced the graceful curve of a guitar's neck with my finger, the years melted away. The workshop was suddenly brighter, filled with the afternoon sun and the sound of B.B. King playing softly from an old radio. I was 25 again, my hair long and brown, bringing Arthur a cup of coffee. He was standing right here, at this bench, a thin piece of dark wood held in a strange metal jig over a steaming pipe. "Come here, Ellie," he'd said, his eyes sparkling. "Watch this." He took my hand and placed it on the wood. "This is Indian rosewood. It's stiff, stubborn. It thinks it knows what it wants to be." He gently pressed the wood against the hot pipe, and as the steam rose, I felt the wood begin to yield, to bend under his knowing hands. It didn't crack or fight. It simply surrendered to a will wiser than its own. "This isn't just wood," he'd whispered, his face close to mine, his breath warm. "It's a voice, waiting to be born. It just takes patience. You can't force it. You have to listen to what it wants to become." The memory was so vivid I could almost feel the steam on my face. I blinked, and I was 68 again, alone in the cold moonlight. I closed the book, a fresh wave of anger washing over my grief. Hot, protective anger. This philosophy, this patience, this love, this was my husband's legacy. This was the stuff Vincent wanted to throw away. This was the jackpot Leo wanted to bulldoze to pay for his digital fantasies. They had been raised in the shadow of this workshop, and yet they had learned nothing. They didn't understand the difference between the price of something and its worth. Arthur's life work wasn't an asset to be liquidated. It was a testament. It was proof that a man could live a good, honorable life and leave the world more beautiful than he found it. I held the heavy book to my chest like a shield. The note was still in my pocket, a cold little square of dread. But it felt different now. Before, it was a terrifying mystery. Now, it was a mission. My sons were not going to erase this. They were not going to turn this sanctuary into a parking lot for a strip mall. I didn't know how yet, but I would not let them. My grief was still a vast, empty ocean, but in the middle of it, a small island of purpose had just broken the surface. I was no longer just Arthur's widow. I was the keeper of his work, the defender of his memory, and I would protect it with everything I had left. That night, holding Arthur's heavy design book to my chest, I knew that grief wasn't enough. Grief was a passive state, a vast ocean of sorrow you could drown in. What I felt now was something sharper, something with an edge. It was a duty. I walked out of the workshop, closed the door on its sacred silence, and went straight to the junk drawer in the kitchen. It's the drawer every American house has, filled with old batteries, rubber bands, and takeout menus. And, thank God, a prepaid track phone I'd bought years ago for a road trip and never used. My hands were surprisingly steady as I powered it on. I unfolded the note the stranger had given me, the paper now soft and worn from being in my pocket, and dialed the number. A man's voice answered on the second ring. It was calm, low, and gave nothing away. "Yes? You gave me a note," I said, my own voice a dry whisper. "At my husband's funeral." There was a pause. "I did. I'm glad you called. Can you meet me tomorrow? 10 a.m., the downtown public library, second floor, study room C. Come alone." The line went dead. The library smelled of old paper, floor wax, and quiet desperation. It was the perfect place to be invisible. Study room C was a small, windowless box with a scuffed table and 2 plastic chairs. The man was already there, waiting. He was in his 50s, with a kind but tired face and the watchful, still eyes of a hawk. He stood when I entered and shook my hand. His grip was firm but brief. He wasn't a comforting man, but he felt competent. That was better. "I'm David Chen, Mrs. Hayes," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I'm a private investigator. Your husband hired me 5 weeks ago." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Why? What did he tell you?" David opened a slim file on the table. It contained only a few papers. "He wasn't here to overwhelm me. He was here to convince me. Arthur came to me after Leo and Vincent tried to get him to co-sign a loan. A very large, very high-interest loan from a private lender. The collateral they offered was this house, and specifically the workshop." He slid a document across the table. It was a copy of the loan application. The amount made me gasp. $500,000. "Arthur refused," David continued. "He told them his workshop was his legacy, not a poker chip for their reckless games. He said that's when they started acting differently. Cold. Desperate. I thought of Arthur's hands, how they could be so strong with a chisel, but so gentle with me. He was a man of immense integrity, but not a man of suspicion. For him to hire a private investigator, the fear he must have been feeling, alone, was a knife in my gut. He told me they were involved in something called a decentralized finance platform," David said, his voice neutral. "Basically, a high-risk crypto scheme. From what I've gathered, it was a house of cards, and the wind was starting to blow. They were on the hook for a lot of money to some very unforgiving people." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Arthur was worried they'd try to forge his signature or pressure him in other ways. He wanted me to protect his assets. He never imagined he needed me to protect his life." A tear escaped and traced a cold path down my cheek. I wiped it away impatiently. "The note you gave me," I said, my voice thick. "It said they planned this. How do you know?" This was the moment of truth. David slid another piece of paper from his file. It was a printout of a pharmacy record. "This is a prescription for your husband's heart medication, metoprolol, filled 3 months ago. Standard dosage. And this," he said, tapping a second sheet, "is a record of a cash purchase made by your son Vincent 2 weeks ago from a pharmacy in the next state over. A beta blocker with a similar name, but a much higher concentration. It's often used in emergency situations to rapidly lower blood pressure. In a man with Arthur's stable condition, an overdose would mimic the symptoms of a sudden, massive cardiac event." The clinical, detached words hung in the airless room. The room started to feel small, tight. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't a random tragedy. It was a transaction. A signature on a death certificate to unlock a signature on a loan document. "I don't have proof they administered it," David said softly. "Not yet. That's where you come in. And I have to be clear, what I'm about to ask you to do is difficult. It's dangerous." I looked at his calm, steady face. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but the protective anger I'd felt in the workshop was rising to meet it. "What do you want me to do?" "For now, nothing. And everything," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Your son's greatest weakness is their arrogance. They see you as a grieving, fragile, slightly confused old woman, a problem to be managed, and then put away. We are going to use that. You are going to play the part they've cast for you." He called it the rope a dope, a boxer's term. Let your opponent punch himself out, let him get overconfident, let him make mistakes. They're going to start pressuring you. They'll try to take control of your finances, the house. They will probably try to have you declared incompetent, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. You will let them try. You will be forgetful. You will be confused. You will be overwhelmed. You will make them believe their plan is working perfectly. The more comfortable they feel, the more careless they'll get with their words and their actions. And we will be there to record every mistake. He slid a small black object across the table. It looked like a simple USB phone charger. This is a high-fidelity audio recorder. Keep it plugged into an outlet where they tend to gather. The kitchen, the living room, it records continuously. All you have to do is let them talk. I stared at the device. It looked so ordinary, so harmless. The idea of being a spy in my own home, of actively deceiving my own children, went against every fiber of my being. I was a woman who valued honesty, who believed in facing problems head-on. But I was facing monsters who wore my son's faces. And you don't fight monsters on their terms. You fight them on yours. I picked up the charger. It felt heavy, a piece of forbidden technology. They won't get away with this, I said. It wasn't a question. It was a vow. No, Mrs. Hayes, David said, and for the first time, a flicker of something like a grim smile touched his lips. They won't. We shook hands again. This time it wasn't an introduction. It was an alliance. I walked out of the library and into the bright, indifferent sunshine, a secret agent in a sensible cardigan. The grief was still with me, a constant companion, but it was no longer the whole story. Now, there was a plan. Walking back into my own home after meeting with David felt like stepping onto a stage. The familiar floral wallpaper, the worn spots on the hardwood floors, the scent of lemon polish, it was all just a set now. And I had just been given the lead role in a play I never wanted to be in. My first act was small. I went to the kitchen outlet, the one right next to the landline phone where my sons always plugged in their devices, and I removed the lamp plug. I took the black USB charger from my purse. It felt cold and alien in my hand. I plugged it in. A tiny, nearly invisible blue light blinked once, then went dark. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for the wolves to come to the door. I didn't have to wait long. A few days later, Vincent came by, using the excuse of dropping off some of my mail he'd picked up. I was in the kitchen, humming to myself and boiling a pot of water for tea. I turned the flame on high, then deliberately walked into the living room, leaving it unattended. It took him less than a minute. "Whoa, Mom!" he called out, his voice a performance of alarm. I heard the click of the gas stove being turned off. He appeared in the doorway, the pot holder still in his hand, his face a mask of practiced concern. "You gotta be careful. You can't just walk away from a hot stove like that." "Oh." I looked at him, arranging my face into what I hoped was a look of mild, sheepish confusion. "Oh dear, did I? My mind is just all over the place these days." I gave a little sad laugh. It felt like swallowing glass. He patted my shoulder, his touch lingering a moment too long. "I know, Mom, it's a lot. We're just worried about you, that's all." He thought he was planting a seed of doubt in my mind, but all he was doing was watering the seed of resolve that was growing in my heart. The main event came the following Saturday. They didn't call first. The doorbell rang, and there they were. Leo, Vincent, and Jasmine, all dressed up like they were going to a country club brunch, and they had a guest. A woman with a smile so wide and white, it looked like it could bite. She had blonde, helmet-like hair and was wearing a bright pink blazer. "Mom," Leo said, stepping inside and giving me a kiss on the cheek that felt like a business transaction. "This is Brenda. She's a friend, and we asked her to come by and just chat." Brenda's handshake was firm and dry, a predator's handshake. "Eleanor, it is such a pleasure," she chirped, her eyes doing a swift professional appraisal of my living room, from the water ring on the coffee table to the dust on the mantelpiece. They herded me into the living room and sat me down on the sofa. And then Leo did something that made my blood run cold. He sat in Arthur's armchair. He settled into it, crossing his legs and resting an arm on the worn leather, claiming the space his father had occupied for 4 decades. It was a calculated act of dominance, a non-verbal declaration that the king was dead and the prince was now in charge. I had to physically grip the sofa cushions to keep from screaming at him to get out of his father's chair. "Play the part, Ellie," I told myself, channeling Arthur's calm voice. "Let them think they're winning." Brenda, it turned out, was not just a friend. She was, in her words, an elder care transition specialist. She launched into a slick, PowerPoint-worthy presentation without the PowerPoint. She spoke in a circular, soothing corporate jargon that was designed to sound helpful while being utterly terrifying. She talked about proactive life management, right-sizing your personal footprint, and minimizing daily stressors for cognitive wellness. She wasn't talking about helping me. She was talking about liquidating me. Then came the props. She pulled a set of thick, glossy brochures from a leather tote bag and fanned them out on the coffee table. "Willow Creek Estates," the cover read, over a stock photo of a silver-haired couple laughing as they played pickleball. Inside were pictures of sterile-looking apartments, community dining halls that looked like hotel buffets, and a list of resort-style amenities. This isn't about taking anything away, Mom," Leo said, leaning forward in Arthur's chair. "It's about adding peace of mind. For everyone." Jasmine chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Eleanor, you've spent your whole life taking care of this big house, taking care of Dad. You deserve a rest. You deserve to be pampered." I picked up a brochure. The paper was heavy, the pictures bright. It felt like something you'd get at a timeshare presentation. I could smell Brenda's perfume, an aggressive floral scent that was starting to give me a headache. I looked at the list of activities: water aerobics, bridge club, movie night. It was a list of ways to quietly wait to die. I forced myself to look vulnerable, to let my hand tremble just a little. I said, my voice soft and reedy. It all looks very expensive. Brenda beamed. That's the beauty of it, Eleanor. We have a financial team that makes the transition seamless. They work with our real estate partners to handle the sale of the primary residence, she meant my home, and all assets, ensuring you have a robust nest egg for your ongoing care. So, you would sell the house? I asked, looking at Leo. And the workshop? Well, of course, Mom, Vincent said, finally speaking up. That's the whole point, to unburden you, all that stuff. It's too much for you to handle. I looked from Leo's smug face in my husband's chair, to Vincent's weak-willed anxiety, to Jasmine's bored impatience. They had rehearsed this whole scene. They were actors, and they were terrible at it. Their concern was a costume, and I could see the cheap seams. The rage in my chest was a living thing, hot and furious. But on my face, I hope, was only the quiet, sad confusion of a woman losing her grip. I put the brochure down. It's a lot to think about, I whispered, looking down at my hands. I'm very tired. It was the perfect response. It was exactly what they wanted to hear. Leo and Brenda exchanged a small, triumphant glance. The fragile old lady was overwhelmed. The plan was working. Of course, Mom, Leo said, standing up from Arthur's chair. You take your time. We'll leave these with you. Brenda will follow up in a few days. After they left, I stood in the silence of my living room for a long time, the smell of Brenda's perfume still hanging in the air like a poison. On my coffee table sat a pile of glossy lies. But in the kitchen, plugged silently into the wall, was my small, black piece of the truth, listening. That pile of glossy brochures sat on my coffee table for 3 days, a monument to my son's greed. I didn't touch them. I didn't have to. They were a declaration of war, and I was busy planning my own quiet campaign. The first move was theirs, as I knew it would be. The phone rang on Tuesday morning, and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring 3 times, took a deep breath, and answered with the slightly shaky, reedy voice I was starting to perfect. Eleanor, it's Brenda. From Saturday? I'm just calling to check in, see how you're doing. Her voice was a weapon, weaponized cheerfulness. Each word was coated in a thick, sticky layer of fake empathy. Oh, Brenda, I said, letting out a long, weary sigh. Yes, hello, it's all just so much. This was my opening move. Play overwhelmed. I completely understand, she chirped. That's why we're here to help. Have you had a chance to look over the materials for Willow Creek? A little, I lied. They're very shiny. I'm just a bit confused about how it all works. Forgive me, my brain is just scrambled eggs these days. You mentioned a real estate partner who handles the sale of the house. Is that person part of your company? There was a slight pause. Well, we work with a preferred network of highly vetted professionals, yes. Oh, that's so convenient, I said, my voice full of naive wonder. And I suppose they take a standard commission? It must get so complicated financially. Does your fee come out of the sale price as well? I'm just trying to understand where all the money goes. Arthur handled all the finances, you see. I can barely balance a checkbook. The silence on her end was a little longer this time. I had introduced the one thing their slick presentation had glossed over, the mechanics of the money. I was no longer just a sad old lady. I was a sad old lady asking about percentages. Eleanor, she said, her voice a little less breezy, those are all details our financial team makes incredibly simple. You really don't have to worry your pretty little head about it. Pretty little head, I almost choked. Oh, good, I whispered. That's a relief. I ended the call by promising to try and think about it more, then hung up and allowed myself a small, grim smile. The first test was a success. My performance as a doddering fool was apparently quite convincing, but I needed more. I needed to know how deep their desperation ran. I needed to see it with my own eyes. That afternoon I went into Arthur's workshop and took his leather design book from the workbench. It was heavy, the size of a family Bible, filled with 40 years of his genius. To my sons, It was junk. But it looked important. It looked like a ledger. It looked like it could hold secrets. It was the perfect bait. I took it to the small office off the living room, the room I hadn't touched since Arthur died, and slid it between a stack of old National Geographic magazines on the bottom shelf of the bookcase, completely hidden from view. 2 days later, Leo called. "Mom, Vince and I are coming over. We need to start going through Dad's bills, get a handle on the estate. We'll bring pizza." It was the illusion of normalcy, of sons helping their widowed mother. I knew what it really was. They were coming to hunt. When they arrived, I was in the office, a stack of envelopes on the desk. I played the part. I sighed. I rubbed my temples. I complained that the numbers were swimming in front of my eyes. They exchanged a look the sea, "She can't handle it" look. They set to work with a predatory efficiency, opening mail, sorting papers into piles. I let them work for 20 minutes, and then I began my own performance. "Oh my goodness," I said, standing up and looking around the room with wide, panicked eyes. "Where is it?" "Where's what, Mom?" Leo asked, not looking up from a bank statement. "Your father's book, his big leather book. It was always right here, on the corner of his desk. I need it." My voice trembled. I put a hand to my chest. I deserved an Oscar. Vincent looked up. "What book? The one with all the drawings?" "Yes, it has all his notes, his everything. I can't lose it. I just can't." I started opening drawers, my movements frantic and clumsy. Maybe I moved it. My mind is such a sieve. That's when I saw it. The flicker of interest in Leo's eyes. He stood up. "Mom, calm down. It's just a book. We'll find it." But his tone had changed. It was no longer patronizing. It was sharply focused. The hunt was on. For the next hour, I watched my 2 sons tear apart their father's office. They were no longer just sorting bills. They were searching. Their initial pretense of helping me quickly evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked urgency. They pulled books from shelves, they shuffled through stacks of paper, their hands moving with a speed that had nothing to do with finding a sentimental keepsake. They were looking for a will, a hidden account number, a deed, some financial silver bullet to save them from their own stupidity. They didn't speak to each other, but they didn't have to. They were a pack, moving with a single, desperate purpose. "Maybe it's in the workshop, Mom," Vincent said, his face flushed with frustration. "No," I said quickly. "He always kept it in here." Finally, Leo threw a stack of papers down on the desk in disgust. "It's not here. You probably put it in a donation box by mistake." The accusation was clear. My failing mind was now a direct threat to their financial salvation. After they left, defeated and angry, I walked back into the silent, ransacked office. A deep, cold certainty settled over me. David was right. Their arrogance was their weakness. They saw an old book. They thought it was a treasure map. They saw a grieving widow. They couldn't see the strategist standing right in front of them. I went to the bookshelf, knelt down, and pulled the heavy design book from its hiding place. I held it to my chest, its familiar weight, a comfort. They had revealed everything. Their desperation was a gaping wound, and they were bleeding all over my house. I walked out of the office and into the kitchen. I unplugged the small black charger from the wall. Then I went back into the office, now filled with the chaos they had created, and plugged it into the outlet right behind their father's desk. This was their new war room. This was where they would talk. And now, I would be listening to every single word. With the little black recorder now silently listening in the office, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The trap was laid, and now the hardest part began. The waiting. The house felt like a pressure cooker, and the only place the valve was released was in the workshop. I found myself spending more and more time there, not searching for clues, but just breathing the air, absorbing the last traces of my husband's peaceful, purposeful energy. It was a kind of therapy. One afternoon, I decided to do some gentle tidying, a way of communing with him by putting his space in order. I was dusting a high shelf filled with his jigs and templates when I noticed a large, dark gray case leaning against the far wall, partially hidden under a canvas drop cloth. I knew this case. It was custom-built, reinforced, and bigger than any of the others. Arthur had only used it for his most important creations. My heart gave a little lurch. I pulled the heavy drop cloth away, the dust making me sneeze, and knelt down. The latches were cold and stiff under my fingers. They snapped open with a series of loud metallic clicks that echoed in the quiet workshop. I lifted the lid, and I forgot to breathe. Inside, nestled in a bed of crushed blue velvet, was a guitar. But it was more than that. It was a promise, a prayer carved from wood. The body was a breathtaking piece of koa wood from Hawaii, its grains shimmering with waves of gold, red, and deep chocolate brown. The neck was a single, perfect piece of mahogany. But it was the fretboard that stole my breath. There, inlaid with stunning precision, was a winding vine of abalone and mother of pearl. It was a morning glory vine, my favorite flower, and it snaked its way up the neck, a river of iridescent color. It was almost finished. The final frets weren't in, the strings weren't on, and the final coat of lacquer hadn't been applied. It was a masterpiece in waiting, a soul on the verge of being born. I reached out and touched the raw, unsealed wood of the soundboard. It was smooth as silk, and the story came rushing back to me. It was about a year ago. Arthur had gotten a call. I'd never seen him so nervous and excited, not even when our sons were born. It was from Caleb Stone, the legendary folk singer, a man whose voice was the gravelly soul of America. His songs were the anthems of coal miners and cowboys, his guitar a national treasure. He had seen one of Arthur's instruments in the hands of another musician and wanted one for himself. "He wants me to build him his final guitar, Ellie," Arthur had said, his eyes shining. "The one he'll play until he's in the ground." He called it his final chord. Oh, for months, this guitar was his obsession. He'd spend hours just looking at the wood, listening to it, he'd say. He sketched the Morning Glory inlay in his design book 100 times until it was perfect. "It's for you too," he'd told me, tracing the pearlescent flowers. "Every song he plays on this, a little piece of us will be in there." The workshop door creaked open, wrenching me back to the present. Leo and Vincent stood there, holding clipboards. They looked like a pair of humorless auditors about to foreclose on a family farm. "Mom, what are you doing sitting on the floor?" Leo asked, his tone impatient. "We're here to take inventory. We need a detailed list of the larger equipment for the estate sale." Vincent's eyes landed on the open case. He walked over, peering inside. "What's this thing?" he asked, reaching in with his soft, clean hands. He picked up the priceless instrument as if it were a piece of 2x4 from Home Depot. "More of Dad's old junk. It's not even finished. We can probably sell this for a few bucks on Craigslist. Some hobbyist might want it." Craigslist. The word hit me with the force of a physical slap. He might as well have suggested using Arthur's design book to start a bonfire. Leo peered over his shoulder. "Vince is right, Mom. We need to clear this stuff out. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills. The realtor said an empty space shows better." "I know." I looked at the masterpiece in Vincent's careless grip. The Morning Glory vine, my Morning Glory vine, about to be sold for parts. A fire I didn't know I possessed roared to life in my chest. I rose from the floor, my knees cracking, but I felt taller than I had in years. I looked directly at Vincent, my gaze so steady and cold that he actually took a step back. "Don't you dare touch that," I said. My voice was low, devoid of any of the frailness I had been performing for weeks. It was the voice of a wife defending her husband. It was the voice of a mother defending her child. It was a voice they hadn't heard since they were teenagers, trying to sneak out past curfew. The silence in the workshop was absolute. Even the dust motes seemed to hang still in the air. Leo and Vincent just stared at me, their mouths slightly agape. They were seeing a ghost, not the ghost of their father, but the ghost of the woman who had raised them, a woman they thought was long gone, buried under a landslide of grief and old age. Leo was the first to recover, putting on his mask of condescending reason. "Mom, let's be realistic." "I am being realistic, Leo." I cut him off, my eyes still locked on the guitar. "That is not stuff. That is not junk. That is your father's soul, and you will not sell it for 30 pieces of silver on the internet." I walked forward and gently, but firmly, took the guitar from Vincent's hands. He let it go without a fight, as if it had suddenly become red hot. I placed it back in its velvet bed and closed the lid, the latches clicking shut like the bolts on a vault. They left soon after, mumbling excuses about another meeting. They had been thrown off their game. They had come to inventory a storage unit, but they'd run into a dragon guarding her treasure. Alone again, I sat on the floor with the case, my hand resting protectively on its lid. The mission had just become crystal clear. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It wasn't just about exposing their crime. It was about this guitar. Arthur had called it his final chord. He never got to finish it. But I would. Somehow, I would make sure his final song was heard. Somehow, I knew that making the decision to finish Arthur's guitar was the final turn of the key. It was no longer just a plan. It was a promise. The very next morning, the burner phone buzzed. It was David. His voice was different, all business. No preamble. "I have it, Eleanor," he said. "They talked. Last night in the office. It's all here, the whole ugly story." I felt a cold wave wash over me, a mixture of dread and profound relief. "And you need to know," he continued, "I made some inquiries. Their main crypto holding, something called Ethereum, took a nosedive overnight. They've been wiped out. They're broke. And they're cornered animals. They're coming for you, Eleanor, today." He was right. An hour later, Leo called. His voice was smooth as silk, the kind of false calm that barely conceals a scream. "Mom, good news. I've got all the final estate paperwork ready to go. It'll be a huge relief to get it off your plate. I'm bringing a notary with me, just to make it all official. We'll be there around 2. Is that okay?" "Yes, Leo," I said, my voice a soft, compliant whisper. "That's fine. Let's meet in the workshop. It's the only place big enough to spread out all the papers." He hesitated for a second, but the thought of getting his hands on the workshop's deed was too tempting. "The workshop it is," he agreed. At 2:00 I was waiting. I had opened the big double doors, letting the afternoon sunlight stream in, illuminating the sawdust that still coated every surface like a fine golden dust. I was sitting on Arthur's stool, in the center of the room. I wasn't a victim waiting for her executioners. I was a queen on her throne, waiting to hold court. For months, I had played a part. Now, all the masks were coming off. They arrived looking victorious. Leo was in his sharpest suit, Vincent in a crisp polo shirt. They were followed by a small, nervous man clutching a briefcase, the notary. My sons' faces were alight with a greedy, triumphant glow. They thought this was their finish line. They had no idea it was mine. "Afternoon, Mom," Leo said, his smile not reaching his eyes. He gestured around the room. "Good. We can get this done, and then I can have the realtor put the sign up out front tomorrow." "Oh." They walked over to Arthur's workbench, my altar, and unrolled the documents with a series of crisp, legal-sounding snaps. They were laying my life out on his legacy, ready for me to sign it all away. The notary, seeing the official-looking papers, began nervously stamping and initialing in the designated boxes. Vincent brought the final signature page over to me, placing it on a small table. Leo followed, holding out a heavy, expensive-looking fountain pen. The same one I'd given Arthur for our 25th anniversary. The cruelty of that detail was not lost on me. "Sign it, Mom," Leo said, his voice low and urgent. "It's over." I looked up from the paper and met his eyes. All the feigned confusion, all the practiced frailty, all of it fell away. My gaze was clear and hard as diamond. "You're right, Leo," I said, my voice ringing with a strength I hadn't heard in years. "It is over." On that cue, the workshop's main door, which I had left slightly ajar, swung fully open. David Chen stepped inside, followed by 2 uniformed police officers. The change in the room was instantaneous. The air crackled. The notary froze, his stamp hovering over an ink pad. Vincent made a small, strangled sound, like a dying animal. Leo's face, so full of smug confidence just a moment before, seemed to collapse in on itself, the color draining away until it was the color of ash. "What is this?" he stammered, looking from me to the officers. "Mom, what have you done?" I didn't answer him. I just nodded toward the small office, where the little black charger was still plugged into the wall. David Chen stepped forward, holding a small digital recorder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words cut through the silent workshop with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Leo Hayes, Vincent Hayes," he said, his voice calm and official. "I am a licensed private investigator. For the past 4 weeks, at your late father's request, I have been investigating his death. This device contains an audio recording from 3 nights ago, made in your father's office. On it, You will hear yourselves discussing the lethal overdose of high-concentration metoprolol, purchased out of state and administered to Arthur Hayes in his morning coffee. You will also be heard finalizing your plan to have your mother, Eleanor Hayes, declared mentally incompetent in order to fraudulently gain control of the assets you are currently attempting to sign over. He clicked a button, and Leo's voice, my own son's voice, filled the sacred space. The old man's heart just gave out. That's the story. The doctor is paid, the death certificate is clean. Now we just need to get Mom to the finish line. David clicked it off. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of 1,000 loving memories, all of them murdered by the sound of that recording. The two officers moved forward. I watched, detached, as if watching a scene from a movie. I saw the glint of metal as the handcuffs came out. I heard the quiet, final click as they were snapped onto my son's wrists, the same wrists I had once kissed better after they'd fallen off their bikes. I heard the officer read them their rights, the familiar words sounding alien and surreal surrounded by the silent, sleeping guitars on the walls. Leo didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his face a blank mask of ruin. But Vincent looked at me. His face was crumpled, his eyes wild with terror and disbelief. And in them, I saw the ghost of the little boy I had once loved, lost forever in a wasteland of his own making. They were led away. The notary was babbling to one of the officers, his hands shaking. David gave me a single, respectful nod. Then he too was gone. I was alone. The unsigned power of attorney still sat on the workbench. I picked up the document, its legal jargon feeling like a foreign language. I walked over to the trash can, the one filled with wood shavings and sawdust, and I dropped it in. The silence in the workshop was different now. It was no longer heavy with secrets. It was clean. It was the silence of a battle won. It was the silence of justice. My eyes went to the gray case in the corner, the one holding Arthur's final, unfinished song. My path was clear. My path was clear, but the first step was into a storm. For an hour after they were taken away, the workshop was a hub of quiet, official activity. The notary, pale and sweating, gave his statement to an officer, his voice a high-pitched, reedy squeak. David explained the next steps to me in his calm, measured way: arraignments, legal proceedings, a trial. It all sounded like a language from another planet. All I could hear was the fading wail of the sirens carrying my sons away. When the last police car finally pulled away, a new kind of silence fell, but it didn't last. The phone started ringing, and ringing, and ringing. I could see the caller ID from the kitchen, names of neighbors, then numbers I didn't recognize, and finally the local news station. I let it ring. The story was no longer mine. It belonged to the world now. The fallout was swift and brutal. It's funny how fast a perfect-looking life can unravel when you pull on a single rotten thread. I didn't have to watch the news to see it. I felt the tremors all the way from my quiet little street. David kept me updated. The digital house of cards my sons had built didn't just collapse, it vaporized. The so-called Ethereum platform they'd sunk everything into was exposed as a massive fraud, a classic pyramid scheme dressed up in fancy tech jargon. They hadn't just lost their own money. They had lost millions of dollars belonging to other people, many of whom were not the forgiving type. One afternoon I saw a black pickup truck, the kind with aggressively large tires, rumble slowly past my house. It slowed in front of Leo's sprawling McMansion 2 towns over. I learned later from a neighbor that the driver, a man with tattoos crawling up his neck, spent an hour pounding on the front door before taping a note to it that was written in very large, very angry red letters. 2 days after that, a bright yellow foreclosure notice appeared on the same door, a legal scar on its perfect suburban face. But the most vivid image, the one that will stick with me, was of Jasmine. David told me the police had been discreet. They'd waited for her. They found her at the elementary school, at a Tuesday afternoon PTA meeting. I can see it so clearly in my mind's eye. Jasmine, in her pristine white tennis skirt and Lululemon top, holding a clipboard and directing volunteers for the annual bake sale. The 2 plainclothes detectives approaching her quietly. The hushed, urgent conversation. The other mothers, their faces a mixture of shock and delicious, horrified gossip, pretending not to stare while grabbing their phones under the table. I pictured her face, the mask of bored superiority cracking and then shattering as they led her out past the playground, her Lululemon dreams turning into a nightmare of holding cells and bail bondsmen. Her white Escalade was impounded the next day from the Whole Foods parking lot. Apparently, it had been leased with funds from one of the fraudulent accounts. Nothing they had was ever really theirs. Their world was a ghost. It was made of credit, of leverage, of digital promises and hollow boasts. When the lights came on, it all just vanished. Meanwhile, my world, the one they had scorned, was solid. It was real. You could touch it, you could smell it. While their lives were imploding in a hailstorm of headlines and legal fees, I retreated to the workshop. I didn't want to think about them, about court dates, about what came next. I just wanted to feel my husband's presence. The space was a mess from their frantic, desperate search for the design book. Papers were scattered, tools were out of place, so I started to clean. It was the only thing I could think to do. I swept the floor, gathering the fine, fragrant dust of cedar and maple into neat piles. I took every single one of Arthur's hand tools from the pegboard walls. I held each one the smooth, worn handle of a chisel, the solid heft of a mallet, the delicate precision of a caliper. I wiped them down with a soft, oil-soaked cloth, polishing the steel until it shone, feeling the perfect balance of them in my own hands. These were the tools that had built a life, an honest, beautiful life. They had paid for our mortgage. They had paid for the college educations that my sons had used to learn how to swindle people. I spent a whole day just organizing. I sorted screws and nails into little glass jars. I stacked lumber according to wood type and age. I polished the thick maple top of Arthur's workbench with lemon oil and beeswax until it glowed with a deep honey-colored warmth. With every methodical, repetitive motion, I felt like I was restoring not just order to the room, but order to my own soul. I was reclaiming this space from the violation of their greed. This wasn't a crime scene. It wasn't an asset to be liquidated. It was a sanctuary, and it was mine now. I felt no joy in their downfall, no satisfying thrill of revenge, just a profound and bottomless sorrow, a sorrow for the two little boys who used to sit on a stool in this very workshop, their eyes wide with wonder as their father made magic with his hands. Where did they go? When did the wonder die, replaced by a bottomless hunger for things that weren't real? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the workshop, I finished my work. The room was clean, quiet, and orderly. It smelled of wood and oil and peace. I picked up one of Arthur's sharpest chisels, its edge gleaming. I felt its weight, its perfect purpose. My work of seeking justice was over. The consequences were now grinding along in a world of lawyers and judges, a world I had no part in. My eyes drifted to the gray case, still closed, leaning against the wall. The work of creation, the work of honoring a legacy, that was just beginning. The work of creation became my salvation. 6 months passed in a blur of sawdust and quiet determination. The trial had been a grim, necessary ordeal. Plea bargains were struck, sentences were handed down, and the story of the Luthier sons became a cautionary tale whispered all over the county. I didn't attend the sentencing. My justice had been served that day in the workshop. The rest was just paperwork. My days were spent with Arthur's tools in my hands. I'd hired one of his old apprentices, a kind, patient man named Ben, to come twice a week and teach me. He taught me how to read the grain of the wood, how to sharpen a chisel to a razor's edge, how to feel the tension of the wood as it bent. My hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong. They were becoming my husband's hands. I was working on the Morning Glory inlay for Caleb Stone's guitar, my head bent over the delicate mother of pearl, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping the fine white dust from my hands, I went to the door, and there, on my front porch, stood Jasmine. I almost didn't recognize her. The perfect blonde hair was gone, replaced by a mousy brown pulled back in a simple ponytail. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a worn gray sweatshirt. Her face was pale and thin, stripped of all its makeup and its arrogance. She looked like a ghost of the woman she had once been. She didn't speak, just stood there, her hands shoved deep into her pockets, looking at her shoes like a chastised child. The anger I thought I would feel, the hot, satisfying rage, it just wasn't there. I was just tired. "What do you want, Jasmine?" I asked. My voice wasn't harsh, just quiet. She finally looked up, and her eyes were full of a raw, desperate emptiness. I just needed to see you," she whispered. "I know I have no right." Oh, part of me wanted to close the door, to lock away the past and get back to my work. But the woman in front of me wasn't a villain anymore. She was just a wreck. "Let's sit on the porch," I said, stepping aside. We sat on the old wooden swing, the one Arthur and I had spent so many summer evenings on. I went inside and made 2 cups of chamomile tea, placing one in her trembling hands. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle creak of the swing's chains. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "They gave Leo 25 to life. He'll be an old man when he gets out, if he gets out." She said it flatly, a statement of fact, not a plea for sympathy. "I took a deal, testified against the lenders he was involved with. I'll do 3 years for accessory and fraud." I just nodded, sipping my tea. "You know the stupidest part of all this?" she said, a bitter little laugh escaping her lips. "The money. We never even got it. The crypto thing was already collapsing. The insurance policies were frozen the second they were arrested. We blew up our whole world. We did what we did. For nothing. For a ghost. It was never even real." She took a shaky breath. "I used to hate this house. I thought it was small, old. I used to look at Arthur in his dusty workshop and I'd feel pity. I thought he was a failure because he wasn't rich, because he drove a 10-year-old Ford, and his greatest accomplishment was getting a good review in some guitar magazine nobody read." She looked out at my simple, well-tended garden. "Last year, for our anniversary, Leo bought me a digital picture frame. You know, the kind you upload pictures to from your phone? He spent a fortune on it. He said it was better than a photo album because you could have 1,000 pictures instead of just 100. We were on the cover of a local business magazine that month, as a power couple. Our portfolio was worth 7 figures, on paper. We had 1,000 pictures of a perfect life, and it was all just air." She finally turned to look at me, her eyes swimming with tears she refused to let fall. "The other day, in my lawyer's office, I saw a picture of my parents. It was an old, faded photograph from the 70s, in a cheap plastic frame. My dad was holding a fish he'd caught. My mom was laughing. It was just one picture, but it was real. You and Arthur, everything you had was real. The workshop, his hands, this porch. He was building something real, and we were building a ghost. Here it was. The lesson, the accounting. It had come at a terrible, terrible price, but she had finally learned it. She hadn't come here to apologize for the crime. She had come to confess her own soul, deep bankruptcy. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice cracking. "I wouldn't, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. What we destroyed, I see it." I looked at her, at this broken woman who had been an architect of my own brokenness, and I felt a profound, aching sadness. Forgiveness wasn't a word that fit. It was too small, too simple. What I felt was a sense of finality. "What you see, Jasmine," I said softly, "is the difference between price and value. Your husband and my son knew the price of everything, but they never understood the value of anything." She nodded, a single tear finally tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She stood up, placed the untouched teacup on the railing, and walked away without another word. I watched her go until her car disappeared around the corner. I didn't feel lighter. I didn't feel healed. I just felt done. That chapter was closed. I went back inside, back to the workshop, back to the comforting smell of cedar and lacquer. I picked up my carving tool. My hands were steady. I looked at the beautiful, winding morning glory vine on the guitar's neck. There was one small, intricate petal left to carve. I leaned in close, my mind clear, my purpose singular. The past was a landscape of ash and ghosts, but the future, right here under my hands, was waiting to be born. That last, delicate petal of the morning glory inlay was the final piece of the puzzle. As I set the tiny sliver of mother of pearl into the fretboard, a sense of profound peace washed over me. The work of justice had been a storm, a hurricane that had torn my life down to the studs. But this quiet, patient work of creation, this was how I rebuilt. For another 2 months, my world was the workshop. It was the rhythm of sanding, the science of applying the 17 paper-thin coats of lacquer, the nerve-wracking process of setting the frets. Ben, Arthur's old apprentice, would come and watch, offering advice but mostly just nodding, a proud look in his eyes. My hands, once strangers to these tools, now moved with a familiar grace. They were my hands, but they held my husband's knowledge. When the final coat of lacquer was polished to a deep, liquid shine, I strung it. One string at a time, I brought the guitar to life, the tuning pegs groaning as the strings tightened, the neck settling under the tension. It was ready. It was breathtaking. The koa wood seemed to glow from within, and the morning glory vine shimmered, a living thing crawling towards the sound hole. It was Arthur's masterpiece, finished with my hands. 2 weeks later, I was in Nashville. I had packed the guitar into its heavy-duty case and driven the 800 miles myself, the track phone I'd used to call David now resting in the junk drawer for good. The air in Nashville felt different, thick with music and ambition. I had an appointment backstage at the Ryman Auditorium, the mother church of country music. Caleb Stone was doing a residency there, and after a series of letters and phone calls, his manager had agreed to a meeting. Walking backstage at the Ryman was like stepping into a history book. The walls were lined with photos of giants: Hank Williams, Johnny Cash, Patsy Cline. I was just a widow from a small town, holding a guitar case. I felt impossibly small until I remembered the treasure I was carrying. Caleb Stone was older than I expected, a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same rugged, honest materials as my husband's workbench. He had kind, tired eyes and hands that were gnarled from a lifetime of playing. He greeted me with a quiet nod and led me to a small, cluttered dressing room. "So, you're Arthur's wife," he said, his voice the familiar, gravelly warmth from 100 records. He wrote me a letter about this guitar, said it was going to be his final chord. He would have been so proud to deliver it to you himself, I said, my voice thick. I opened the case. Caleb didn't say a word. He just looked. His eyes traced the lines of the body, the perfect joinery of the neck, and then they settled on the morning glory inlay. He reached out a single crooked finger and gently traced the path of the vine. "Well, I'll be," he whispered. He told me he was putting a little piece of his own love story in here. He lifted the guitar from its case with a reverence that made my heart ache. He held it up, inspecting it from every angle. Then he settled into a chair, cradled the instrument in his arms, and with a calloused thumb, he strummed a single open chord. The sound that filled that small room was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. It was a voice, deep, resonant, and clear as a mountain spring. It was the voice of the koa wood, the voice of the rosewood, the voice of Arthur's hands, and maybe, just a little, the voice of mine. It was a sound of pure, undeniable truth. It was the sound of something real. Caleb closed his eyes, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. He'd found his final chord. And in that moment, I knew Arthur's legacy was safe. It wasn't in a bank account or a deed to a property. It was right here, a living, breathing song in the hands of a master. Today, my house is quiet. The workshop is my studio. I take on small repair jobs for local musicians, and I'm slowly, patiently building a guitar of my own design. Sometimes, late at night when I'm sitting on the porch swing, I think about my sons. I don't feel anger anymore, just a vast, empty pity. They had a kingdom of true value at their fingertips, and they traded it all for a handful of digital dust. They built a ghost, and they became ghosts themselves. My husband and I, we built a life. It was a simple structure, built with humble materials, love, integrity, and hard work. But it was solid. It was real. And when the storm came, it was the only thing left standing. They saw their father's life as an asset to be liquidated. But a life's true work, a life's true love, can never be sold. It can only be honored. So let me ask you, when the world is screaming at you about price, about profit, about getting ahead at all costs, do you have the courage to listen for the quiet whisper of true value? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your words and support mean the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the hardest of times.